I wasn't supposed to be there. That's the thing nobody tells you about the moments that change you. You stumble into them sideways, holding a lukewarm coffee and arguing with yourself about whether your shoes are going to destroy your feet before noon. Mine were basically already losing the argument, which I'd come to London for a conference. Something about sustainable architecture that I'd volunteered for back in February when February felt far away and noble intentions were cheap. The conference had ended 2 days early because the main speaker had food poisoning, spectacular, catastrophic food poisoning, the kind people describe at dinner parties for years, and, suddenly, I'd 48 unscheduled hours in a city that smelled like rain and bus exhaust and something older underneath both of those things. Something that had been breathing here long before anyone thought to name it. So I walked. I think, that's all. That's the whole setup. I just walked. The morning was the kind London does better than anywhere, not sunny, not stormy, just this pewter gray light that makes every building look like it was painted by someone who understood melancholy as an aesthetic choice. The kind of light that makes tourists pull out cameras and locals pull their collars up, and both of them are right. I'd no collar. I'd a light jacket, optimism, and bad shoes. I came down the mall without really meaning to. If you've never walked the mall in London on a morning when something is about to happen, I'm not sure I can explain it properly. It's a wide, tree-lined avenue that runs straight as an argument from Trafalgar Square toward Buckingham Palace, and there's something about walking it that makes your spine do something involuntary. Straighten, maybe look, or just brace. Like your body understands before your brain catches up that this road was not built for ordinary foot traffic. It was built for processions. For moments. For the specific human theater that says, here, something matters. I noticed the crowd before I understood what the crowd meant. Not a mob. Not chaotic. More like, pretty much, sediment. People had gathered the way sediment gathers, slowly, over hours, layer by layer, pressed against the metal barriers that lined the road with a patience that felt almost geological. Tourists with cameras raised like offerings, which locals who'd clearly been there since before the dew burned off, thermos flasks, folding chairs, the whole archaeology of people who knew something was coming and had decided it was worth the cold. I stopped next to a woman who was perhaps 70, perhaps 90, one of those British women whose age becomes irrelevant somewhere around 65 because they settle into a kind of permanent, unassailable competence. She had a Union Jack scarf and a thermos that smelled aggressively of builder's tea, and she was watching the palace end of the mall with the focused attention of someone who has been watching this exact road for significant occasions for most of her adult life. "Excuse me," I said. "What's happening?" She looked at me the way you look at someone who has asked what color the sky is. "They're coming out," she said. "Who is?" She turned then. Honestly, full face. I mean, the look wasn't unkind. It was the look of someone deciding whether to be patient or simply point. "William and Catherine," she said. "First pretty much official engagement, which is Prince and Princess of Wales." She paused. Then, something shifted in her face, something that had nothing to do with titles. "First TBH, time they've come out as what they are now. Since TBH, Charles became king." I didn't fully understand, in that moment, the weight she was putting into the word now. I do now, which the crowd was still building. I found a spot against the barrier maybe 30 meters back from a cluster of photographers who had arranged themselves with the territorial precision of people who had been doing this for 20 years and had opinions about exactly which angle caught the light off the palace facade at this hour. They had enormous lenses, all of them, the kind that suggests the person holding them has devoted a significant portion of their life to being in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. For what it's worth, I'd my phone. I was not, in any professional sense, covering this. But something had nailed my feet to the pavement. There was a man beside me, mid-40s, North American accent, Canadian I'd guess from the particular politeness with which he'd maneuvered into his spot, who was vibrating with a specific frequency of excitement that suggested he had planned this. Researched it, in my opinion, and had possibly reorganized his itinerary around it with the thoroughness that some people reserve for sporting events or music festivals. "You know what today is?" he said to me, not really asking. "I'm learning," I said. He told me, the way a person tells you when they love the thing they're telling you about and the love has nowhere else to go, that this was the first time William and Catherine, the Prince and Princess of Wales, were making a public appearance in that capacity since the death of Queen Elizabeth. Since the night in September when the world had watched Balmoral and known, the way you know before you're told, that something irrevocable was happening. "It's not just an appearance," he said. "It's the first time the line of succession becomes visible. You understand? Charles is king. That means William is next. And Catherine she's the future queen. And today is the first time they walk out into this." He gestured at the mall, at the grey sky, at all of us standing there breathing the same cold air as that. I looked at the palace end of the road. The Victoria Memorial stood there the way it always stands, that white marble monument with the gilded Victory on top, the one that tourists photograph from every conceivable angle and that has absorbed, across its century of existence, a quantity of human ceremony that should by rights make the stone glow with it. The fountains weren't running. The sky above it was the color of old silver. And I thought about what it would feel like to walk out into that. Not the ceremony, not the titles, but the knowledge. Plus, the absolute, irrevocable knowledge that everything had changed, that your life had become something different from what it was the morning before, and that the change was not the kind you could unbecome. That you were now the container for something larger than yourself, and the only question was whether you'd carry it with grace or buckle under it. I thought about Catherine specifically. I'd seen her, the way everyone who pays any attention to the world had seen her, in photographs, in videos, at events, through the specific flattening lens of public life that turns human beings into symbols whether they want it or not. And I'd always had the sense, this is hard to explain without sounding like I knew her, which I absolutely didn't, of someone making a continuous, deliberate choice. Not performing. Choosing, and over, in each frame, in each public moment, the choice to be present and composed and real inside a role that could very easily swallow a person whole. I wondered, I guess, if today felt different. I wondered TBH if today was the day when the weight of the thing became not lighter, exactly, but named. The crowd pressed gently forward. We waited. Plus, the first signal was the horses. Not a trumpet. Not an announcement. Just the sound of hooves on tarmac, coming from the palace end, and the way that sound traveled through the crowd was interesting. It didn't cause noise, it caused the opposite. A kind of collective inhale, a held breath wearing the shape of 2,000 people. Then, the cars. Black, gleaming, moving with the specific unhurried authority of vehicles that don't need to rush because everything else stops for them. They came down the mall and the crowd leaned, not forward exactly, more like a single organism adjusting its orientation towards something it had been waiting for without being sure it was waiting. The Canadian look beside me had his camera up before I realized I'd raised my phone. And then, the cars were stopping, and doors were opening, and there they were. This is the part that's difficult to write without sliding into something sentimental, and I want to resist that because what I felt standing there was not sentimental. It was something sharper. More specific. The kind of feeling that catches you off guard because you didn't expect it from yourself. Catherine stepped, out first, on her side, and the thing that struck me, the very first thing, before anything else registered, was that she looked up. Not at the crowd, not at the cameras. Up. Plus, at the sky. Just for a moment. 1 second where she stood beside the car and looked at the pewter grey London sky as if checking something. Taking a reading, making a private note. In my opinion, then, she looked forward. Look, and she walked. I'm going to stop here and tell you what the older woman with the thermos did in that moment, because it mattered more than I expected. She didn't cheer. She didn't wave her flag. She stood very still, and she pressed one hand flat against her chest the way you do when something hits somewhere near the heart and you want to locate it, and she said, quietly, to nobody in particular, there she's. Not there they are. Not look at the prince and princess. TBH, just there she's. Like she'd been waiting to say it. Like the sentence had been waiting inside her for months, since September, since the day everything changed, and this was the first morning it was true in a way you could see with your own eyes. I didn't know her name, I didn't ask. But, to be fair, I won't forget that. There she's, William was beside her, and I want to be precise about what I mean when I say that because it matters. Not behind. Not ahead. Beside. There's a whole language in that, in where people stand relative to each other, in how bodies arrange themselves in space, and the language William and Catherine spoke with the simple geography of their positioning was one of the clearest things about the morning. Whatever else this was, ceremony, obligation, the continuation of 1,000 years of institutional theater, this was also two people who had chosen each other and were choosing each other again, publicly, in the specific way that public people sometimes do the most private things in front of everyone. He leaned slightly toward her when someone said something near the rope line. Not much. Plus, an inch, honestly, maybe less. The lean, of a person who's perpetually, reflexively oriented toward someone else's presence. She laughed, really laughed, not the careful managed smile of formal occasions, at whatever was said, and, for a half-second her composure went entirely and, she was just a woman laughing in the cold morning air and, it was that half-second, that small unguarded pocket, that made the crowd around me actually make noise. Not applause. Something warmer. A kind of collective exhale that was also recognition. The Canadian kind of, beside me lowered his camera and said, "Oh, she's real," with an expression of relief, like he'd been holding a quiet worry about that and the laugh had resolved it. I need to back up, and, because this is a story about a moment, but moments are made of everything that led to them, and, standing there at the barrier I found myself thinking, with a clarity that surprised me, about who Catherine actually was before she became what she was becoming. Not the tabloid version. Not the fairy tale version. The actual version, to be fair, which is to say, the version that's hardest to see because it gets buried under all the others. She was a person who waited. That sounds passive. It wasn't. There's a kind of waiting that's active, that requires enormous reserves of self-possession and patience and the willingness to be perpetually misread, to be called things by people who didn't know you, to exist in a public space while refusing to let that space tell you who you were. She'd done it for years, through the engagement and the wedding and the children and the grief and the particular grinding pressure of being loved by a country that expressed its love partly through watching your every move for signs of cracking. She hadn't cracked. And, today she was walking down the mall as Princess of Wales. The thought arrived with an unexpected force, she carried this before she was given the title for it. The title was just the thing that made visible what had already been true. They moved along the rope line. This basically is where I saw something that I'm going to describe carefully because it's the kind of thing that's easy to overstate, and I don't want to overstate it. There was a girl, she couldn't have been more than 7, who had been standing at the front of the barrier for what was clearly a very long time. She had a small handmade flag, the kind where you can see the effort in the unsteady lines, and she had clearly made it herself and she was holding it with both hands and she had the expression of a child who has been promised something magical and is in the agonizing, shivery business of waiting for it to arrive. When Catherine reached her section of the rope line, the girl's face did something I don't have precise language for. It wasn't awe, exactly, though it was that. It wasn't excitement, though it was that too. It was more like confirmation. The face of someone for whom a story they'd been told has just stepped off the page and become real. Catherine crouched down. Not a, to be fair, brief, performative crouch. A real one. Down to the child's level, the way you do when you're actually trying to see someone's face. She said something, I couldn't hear it, I was too far away, and the girl looked at her flag and then held it out. An offering. Catherine looked at it with the full weight of her attention. Not a glance, not a polite acknowledgement. Looked at it, at the unsteady lines, at the effort in it, and said something else. And the girl's face, if it had been possible for it to go brighter, went brighter. The older woman beside me, the one with the thermos, made a small sound in her throat. The kind, I think, of sound that's not quite a word. I understood it anyway. They moved on. And this is basically where the mood shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that had a clear cause, but perceptibly. The kind of way temperature changes before rain, before you can see any clouds. Something in the quality of the morning altered. I traced it, later, to the moment when they reached the section of the crowd that was older. The people who had been here before. who had watched this road for 50 years of royal occasions, who had stood here for the Silver Jubilee, for Charles and Diana, for the funerals, for the weddings, for the coronations. Who therefore understood in their bones what they were watching today in a way that the Canadian beside me, who had researched it thoroughly, couldn't quite touch. These were people for whom continuity was personal. Who remembered Queen Elizabeth the way you remember someone you actually knew, because in some particular, non-literal way, they did know her. Not privately, but publicly, which is its own kind of intimacy, accumulated over decades of occasions. Christmas speeches and the reliable, anchoring presence of a face on every coin in your pocket. She was gone now. And here was the next thing. Not a replacement, you can't replace what she was, and I don't think anyone standing there was confused about that. To be fair, but the continuation. The carrying forward of something that had to be carried forward or it would end. William and Catherine were the carrying forward. And, looking at the older faces in the crowd, the ones who were quiet, who weren't waving flags, who were just watching with the particular attention of people reading something important, I understood that this was the weight of the morning. This, was what made it different from an ordinary royal appearance. This was the first time the country looked at the next generation and had to believe in it. Not because they'd chosen to believe, but because the alternative was grief without end. Catherine turned, at one point, and looked back toward William. It was a actually brief look. Half a second. But it basically was the look of someone checking in. Not asking for help, she didn't need help, she was entirely at ease in that crowd. But the look of someone who, in the midst of a thing that is large and somewhat overwhelming, wants to verify the location of the person they trust most in the world. He caught it. Plus, he was 3 people down the rope line, mid-handshake with an older gentleman, and he caught her look with the peripheral awareness of someone who's perpetually attuned to exactly this signal, and he didn't stop the handshake, didn't look away from the man he was speaking to. But something in his posture changed. Fractionally. The way a person settles when they've confirmed something important. She turned back to the crowd. Plus, and I thought, there it's not the ceremony. Not the title, that wordless check-in and the wordless response to it, that is the architecture underneath all of this. That's what TBH makes the rest of it hold. Part 3, what it means to become the thing you've been waiting for. Around midday the light changed. London light will do this, it shifts without warning from pewter to something almost golden, as if the city briefly decides to be generous, and, when it does, everything it lands on looks more significant than it did 5 minutes ago. The Victoria Memorial caught it first, the gilded Victory on top catching the low-angle sun and throwing it back in a way that made several people in the crowd reach for their cameras in the same instant. The ceremony, like whatever its official designation was, I never entirely established the formal name of what I was watching, had moved to the outer steps of a building I won't try to precisely identify because I'm not confident in the identification, and this is not the story where I pretend expertise I don't have. What I know is that they were above us now. Not by much. A flight of stone steps, maybe. But enough that the perspective shifted enough that the crowd had to look up slightly, and they were looking down slightly, and that slight angular difference between a crowd looking up and 2 people looking out is one of the oldest and most legible geometries of public ceremony. It says, here's the threshold. Here is the distinction. Here is the moment when you understand what has changed. Catherine stood at the top of those steps and, for one moment, she was entirely still. Not posed, not arranged. Not performing the stillness. Just still. The way a person is still when they are doing something internally that doesn't have an outward face. When they are taking the full measure of something. When they are deciding to be equal to it. The crowd felt it. You could hear it, not in noise, but in the opposite of noise. The cessation of the low-level murmur that had been running under everything all morning. 2,000 people deciding simultaneously that this was a moment that deserved quiet. William was a half-step behind her and, to the right. Then, he moved. He stepped up beside her, not past her. Beside. And, he didn't look at the crowd, not first. He looked at her. Just briefly. The look of someone performing a private check before a public act. Are you ready? Which are we doing this? She didn't turn, to meet it. But her chin lifted. Plus, barely perceptibly. The way a person lifts when they've made a decision and the body is ratifying it. Yes, and, pretty much, we're doing this. The wave, when it came, was not the practiced thing you see in photographs. It was more personal than that. More human. She raised her hand toward the crowd with a directness that felt less like ceremony and more like acknowledgement. Like she was seeing specific people in that mass of faces and making the gesture at them, not at the general concept of a public. And the crowd made a sound I haven't been able to accurately describe to anyone I've told this story to since. Not cheering, though it had the volume of cheering. Not applause. It was something else, something that had grief in it and hope in it and welcome in it and the specific, ungovernable emotion of people who have been holding something for a long time and are finally being given somewhere to put it. The older woman beside me, the one I'd been standing near all morning, the one with the thermos and the Union Jack scarf, made that sound again. The one, to be fair, that wasn't quite a word. Then, she did say a word. Plus, finally, dot. And I didn't ask her what she meant by it, because I understood what she meant by it. Not finally, as in relief that a waiting was over. Finally, as in, here's the thing that needed to happen for the grief to move forward. Here is the moment when loss becomes, not smaller, but accompanied. Here are the people who will carry it from here. I've been trying to explain this to people who weren't there and I don't think I've been doing it well. The difficulty is that what happened was, on its surface, a fairly ordinary piece of royal ceremony. Too honestly, people appeared in public. They walked along a rope line. They shook hands and crouched down to talk to children and accepted flowers and smiled at cameras. This is a thing that has happened countless times before on this same stretch of road, in this same pewter London air, in front of crowds that have stood in essentially the same configuration for generations. But context is everything. Context is the entire thing. Because this was not a normal moment in the sequence of royal occasions. This was the first one in the aftertime. The first time the crowd had assembled and the next generation had walked out and the question, the enormous, unspoken, collective question that had been hanging in the air since September had been answered not in words but in presence. Is there a future? Which here they are. Here is the future. It is walking toward you down the mall and it's real and it's present and it's, against all the odds of what this year has asked of everyone, composed. That was what the crowd heard in itself when it made that sound. Not ceremony. Not theater. Yes, and I stayed until the cars came back. Most of the crowd had already thinned, the tourists peeling away in groups, checking their phones, recalibrating their afternoons, but the core of people who had been there from the beginning remained at the barriers with the patience of people who knew that arrivals and departures are both worth witnessing, that the returning is as much a part of the thing as the arriving. William came out first, not for protocol reasons, I think, but practical ones, the kind of small asymmetry in timing that happens when two people are navigating a door, and then, Catherine, and, for a moment they stood together on the steps before descending to the cars. She said something to him. He laughed. That's it. Kind of, that's the whole thing. She said something, and he laughed properly, the kind of laugh that collapses the formality of a person, that strips them temporarily back to whoever they are when they're not being watched, and then, they were descending the steps and the ceremony of the morning was folding itself up and becoming the past. But I held that moment, a woman who has just spent a morning being looked at by thousands of people, who has just stepped formally and publicly into the largest role of her life, who has just absorbed 2,000 people's grief and hope and welcome and directed it into something graceful and present. That woman said something that made someone she loved laugh. That's what I took home, not the ceremony. Not, I think, the history, not the titles or the pageantry or the gold on the Victoria Memorial catching the afternoon light. That laugh. Plus, and the evidence of an ordinary, extraordinary life continuing inside all of it. I found the woman with the thermos one more time, near the barriers, gathering her things, the folding stool. The small bag, the Union Jack scarf that she folded with the careful precision of someone folding something that mattered. I wanted to be fair, to ask her something, and I wasn't sure what. Were you here for Diana? I said. On this road? She looked at me for a moment. Yes, she said. And Charles and Diana, I said. When they were what William and Catherine are now. Yes, she said again. She picked up her thermos. And it's different, I said. It wasn't quite a question. Actually, she thought about it. Genuinely considered it, in the way that people who have seen a great deal consider things, without rushing, without performing certainty they don't have. She's different, she said finally. Catherine. Plus, she knows what she's walked into. She came in with her eyes open. She paused. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. She smiled at me. Not warmly, I mean, exactly, but with a kind of brisk acknowledgement, one stranger to another who have briefly shared something that neither of them will forget. Then, she walked away down the mall. And I stood there for a while longer, in the thinning crowd, in the London light. That had gone, I guess, back to pewter, thinking about what it means to walk into something with your eyes open. To choose it. To carry it not because you've to, but because you've decided that you're the person who will. To stand, I guess, at the top of a flight of steps and be still for one moment, that one full, private, internal moment, and then lift your chin and look out at the people looking at you and give them what they need without losing what you're. To say, with your presence, simply and completely, I am here. I am not going anywhere, you are not alone in this. The mall was nearly empty by the time I turned to walk back. The barriers were still up. The photographers were packing their enormous lenses into cases with the practiced efficiency of people whose whole professional life is these moments and the transitions between them. Someone had left a handmade flag caught against the base of a barrier, small, slightly crumpled, the flag of a child who had held it for a long cold morning and, perhaps let it go in the excitement of a wave answered. I thought about picking it up, which I didn't. It seemed like the right thing was to leave it there. Evidence that someone small had stood here in the cold. Waited and, believed and, been, in the end, rewarded not with a fairy tale, but with something better. With a real woman looking at her real flag and seeing, in its unsteady lines, something worth looking at. That's the thing about history, I think. We build it big, we dress it in marble and gilded victory and centuries of ceremony, and then, the moments that actually matter are the small ones. A child's flag. A woman's laugh. An old woman look, pressing her hand to her chest and saying, quietly, to nobody in particular, there she's. The cars were gone. The mall was just a road again, and, somewhere in that city, Catherine, Princess of Wales, future queen, a woman who had walked into something enormous with her eyes open, was having what I hope was a very large cup of tea and a moment, however brief, of quiet. She'd earned it, and she'd earned all of it.